Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chair. I'd like to begin by thanking all our speakers. I'm sure you'd agree that they've all given us concise and informed overviews of the attitude of their respective countries that they were addressing. The common theme was that of middle powers struggling to find an appropriate policy path at this point, given their increasing concern. On the one hand, we heard that plenty was being done in all four countries, increased military spending and so on. But on the other, reading between the lines, it would seem that there was a struggle to find a path forward that is actually going to make a decisive difference. None, for example, seem to be prepared to challenge China directly, certainly other than in rhetoric. I'm going to address my remarks to another theme that has come up in these papers on middle powers, that of international law and the so-called rules-based international order, and the calls by, I think, all four states for China to live by the ruling and to respect UNCLOS. It was particularly a theme in the papers on Japan and Australia. Perhaps more came out in the written papers, I think, than in the presentations. But also we heard about this in the response of India, which has made increasingly strong calls for respect for international law to play a role. And also Indonesia's official response was to call for respect for UNCLOS. Now, of course, we've got a whole session tomorrow morning devoted to this topic of international law and the South China Sea arbitration, which will likely go into some of the more specific issues that came to the fore through the process, the definition of islands and so on. But also, I hope, will speak to the broader picture as to whether the arbitration and potential future arbitrations, because we heard about that as well, will avoid or contribute to a worsening situation. So how can we interpret these strident calls for respect for UNCLOS? So in a sense, I'm going to use my time, if you'll excuse me, to respond to these, but also I think you may hear echoes of some other themes that have come up in presentations today, because I couldn't help but listen to them through this sort of framework. So I'm going to just say a few remarks about the engagement of China with international law, the impact of third-party dispute resolution, what we know about it in other scenarios, the relationship of international law to changing distribution of power. International law often conveys an image of and is thought of as a relatively timeless feature of world politics. But of course, international law is far more malleable and an evolving subsystem than that image conveys. It can serve to moderate the effects of the conduct of realpolitik, but from my reading of it, it is better doing so within the confines of an existing international law than during a period of fundamental order transition. This is because international law is integral to relations of power, but at the same time has a degree of internal coherence and autonomy from political relationships. So international law can play this role well where the distribution of power equates broadly with the distribution of legal rights and responsibilities, and indeed where the values and norms embedded in law align with those influential in the system. If they were to coincide exactly, then law would have no independent pull, and I respectfully suggest all these countries wouldn't be calling on China to abide by international law. On the other hand, it would not be sustainable to have the two contrasting too far. In such a situation, there would likely either be a radical shift in outlook and behaviour, or else more likely the law would simply be ignored. Caused by regional powers for a rules-based international order and China's reaction to the arbitration is something that needs to be viewed, therefore, I would suggest, in this broader context. And there is a broader debate going on along these lines about what sort of a power China is or is going to be in the future, and what impact this highly institutionalised international order we're going to have how it's going to play out with the rise of China. Well, what I'd suggest is that it's not just having a thick web of institutions that matters, but it's actually the specific terms in the law that matters and who they favour. And so far, China, even despite its earlier experience of being subjected to unequal treaties and all the resentment that goes along with that, in the post-World War II era, has done very well from international law, and it's been able to rise without coming up against provisions of international law that have fundamentally blocked China from pursuing its interests. If we look at the various cornerstone treaties of our international order that is currently potentially in transition, we can see that they haven't been equitable treaties, but on the whole, China has actually been on the upper side of the inequities in a way that other rising powers are not. And so international law has facilitated China's rise to date. Just give a couple of examples. So from the NPT, China exploded its first test, or made it in 1964. The cut-off date for nuclear weapon states in the NPT is 1967. So China's been on the upper hand of that inequitable treaty bargain. If we look at it, other examples in the UNFCCC, that's inequitable, but through the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities has favoured developing countries. So China's done very well from that inequity as well. And of course, of all the global treaties, the treaty inequity that has most served China has been the Charter provisions giving China a permanent seat on the Security Council, enabling it to increase its input in global security decision-making as it has wanted to do so in line with its increasing weight in the international system. So what I'm leading to is that of a whole set of core international law regimes, on the whole, China's done very well from the post-World War II international order, and it's the Law of the Sea Convention that in normative terms is blocking China's interests or its perceived interest and rise. And we're seeing the implications of this. So I'd just like to pick up a couple of other themes in the papers today. One was the difficulty of identifying a US game plan in respect of the South China Sea. But I would like to apply that to international law as well and say that we're seeing this same issue cropping up with the international legal system. Admittedly, you could say there's never been a single US game plan, and I take Shahar's point there that maybe domestic factors often explain what happens with any country's foreign policy. But I think it's not surprising that China may have thought of the arbitral proceedings as a US plot, because the system of international law has been US driven. And so underpinning all these calls for rules, well, for international law or rules-based order, I'm coming to that in a moment, is an association of that system actually with the United States. But the United States itself has been walking away from the ideal of an international rule of law, in a narrow sense by not ratifying the Law of the Sea Convention. But more broadly, I'd suggest from shifting its rhetoric away from international law and the ideal of an international rule of law towards that of a rules-based international order. Now, I know we've all got sort of used to, in defence circles, thinking they're more or less the same thing, a rules-based international order and an international rule of law. But I'd suggest they're not the same, and that a rules-based international law is a far weaker version. And so in using that rhetoric and moving in that direction, the United States is also sending mixed signals here and a weakness that we wouldn't have seen a while ago. US officials seem to have convinced themselves that if key agreements are left as political deals, such as that with Iran over nuclear matters, or court agreements despite their treaty status as per the Paris Agreement, this doesn't matter. So I don't want to preempt tomorrow's morning's panel on what role international law can play in addressing the South China Sea issue, because I just want to underline that this is, I think, where we need nuanced analysis of just what scope there is for breakthrough via international law, particularly if this is a main hope that middle powers have as what is going to be a game changer. There have been studies of when third-party dispute resolution in international law is successful in resolving disputes. And just to give you a flavour of this, third-party dispute resolution tends to have worked best where both parties are prepared to accept compromise, and has sometimes been useful for national leaders who want to compromise but would not otherwise be able to convince their populations of the wisdom of doing so. Neither seem to be the position here. So on the face of it, the impact of these strident calls for respect for the Law of the Sea Convention and the arbitration, I'd say, can be interpreted as a hardening of positions rather than as contributing to a mediation of positions. Thank you. I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you, Professor Scott. I actually always thinking that the four judges that we mentioned are always have the increasingly influence in the region, both politically and economically. And we small countries in the region always want to see they are more active and more substantive participation and contribution to the work of the region. So now, in this light, I think that the floor is open for Q&A section, and because we resume our section 15 minutes behind the schedule, that's why the section for Q&A perhaps may be prolonged for about more than 10 minutes. Thank you. So please.
Thank you, Ambassador Yamagami Jaya. Well, this afternoon, I have seen some speakers speaking rather critically of their own government's policies. And now being out of the government, I would like to join that bandwagon. So first, my comment and question to Kotani-san, my colleague. I think you are quite right in pointing out the connectivity, between what's happening in the East China Sea and also what's happening in the South China Sea. But given onslaught of aggression on the part of Japan's counterpart, why not Japan react, more, strongly to, what's happening in Senkaku? I think, Japan has been exercising its utmost restraint so far, by not stationing any personnel on those islands, by not building any installations, even including lighthouses on those islands. But look at what China did in the South China Sea. So if China starts to send its Navy ships, to the waters nearby Senkaku, why not Japan respond in a more forceful manner? Not, tit-for-tat manner, but securing Japanese administration over those islands, stationing self-defense forces personnel on the islands, building facilities, port, lighthouse. So I'd like to hear your views on this. That's my first question. And listening to, say, Indian situation and Australian situation, I just wonder, there may be some preperceptions in those countries that what has been happening in the South China Sea could be just restricted to that body of water. Isn't there any thinking on the part of New Delhi policymakers or Canberra policymakers that they might be facing Munich moment? What happened to Dresden could be repeated in Poland. Is there any such thinking? For example, in India, what took place in the East China Sea and South China Sea could be repeated sometime in the near future in the Indian Ocean, given what they are trying to do, the port, in Pakistan. That is my question to Darshana and Yuan. And finally, about Indonesia, leadership of Indonesia. I don't think anybody is expecting Indonesia to send its boats or Navy ships to the South China Sea. Yes. But leadership can be exercised in some other manner. Securing the unity and integrity of ASEAN is one thing, but what about convening some kind of multilateral regional conference on this issue of the South China Sea? I think Kotani-san was referring to the experience of San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951. Actually, it was in that conference where Japan renounced its claim to Paracel Islands, Spratly Islands. But the limit of the San Francisco Peace Treaty is it didn't provide for which country those renounced islands are going to belong to. So if that is a historical fact, why not convene San Francisco Peace Conference Mark II by the initiative of major power like Indonesia? That is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentations. I had a question for Dr. Mohibat. Apologies for the pronunciation. I'd be interested in getting your views on, I suppose, the internal dynamics of the debate within Indonesia on how to address China and the South China Sea, the 9-dash line claim, how it overlaps with the Natuna issue for the Indonesians. I mean, I guess my experience talking to some people in Jakarta is that there seems to be, at least prima facie, a kind of a gap between the foreign ministry and military types, and how that intersects, I suppose, with the kind of resurgence of nationalism in Indonesia, and not just in relation to the South China Sea, but also in relation to the perception in some quarters that Chinese investment is hollowing out the economy, which seems to be quite a powerful sense that ties into that intersects with that resurgence of nationalism.
Good afternoon. Lucio Pitlo from the Philippines. I have two questions, one for Dr. Kotani from Japan, and the other one to Dr. Muhibat from Indonesia. I'll start with Dr. Kotani. I think investments and trade is one underappreciated aspect of engagement between China and ASEAN, and this in a way affects how ASEAN states respond to contingencies in the South China Sea, because there's a lot of economic fundamentals that they also consider. So in relation to this, Japan for the longest time had been the major donor and investor for ASEAN. But in recent years, we know for a fact that China had been very active in this sector, notably with their Maritime Silk Road, their Belt and Road Initiative, and now with this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. How are these new developments triggering a reconsideration or rethinking on the part of Japan in terms of adjusting their lending policies to make them more competitive in relation to Chinese investors? Chinese companies, SOEs, when they came into Southeast Asia, they're backed by their government, sovereign guarantee, they got a lot of loans, extension of credit, and so on. Are Japanese investors being in terms of competition, are they being left out because of all of these advantages being enjoyed by their Chinese peers? To Dr. Kotani, in the aftermath of the 2012 failure to come up with a joint communique of ASEAN, Foreign Minister Natale Gawa made several rounds in ASEAN capitals trying to salvage some form of a statement. I'm wondering why, after the Kunming incident just this year, we did not see a similar initiative from Indonesia. Thank you.
Okay, to maintain a balance of question, I will ask a question to Iran about Australia's approach to the South China Sea. At the end of your presentation, and you made the claim that what Australia will do in future and will depend on the situation of China-U.S. relationship. So I was wondering why that isn't Australia's action, whether to undertake the freedom of navigation or not, or to the South China Sea, being driven by Australia's national interest, which you talk about either a direct or indirect one, but why at the end Australia's decision will be solely dependent on one factor, that is Sino-US relation?
Thank you. Any? No, please.
Isawa from Japanese Embassy, and question about Graham. Relation with the United States. I think we are a little bit concerned about the negotiation of the cost sharing of the force posture review. So I think that it is high time for you to complete this negotiation. But so far in the newspapers, there is no voice among the Australian academics and opinion leaders. I think that you had a better voice. You are warning to the government to push a little bit, accelerate the negotiation. Otherwise, with the new government, you have to start from scratch this negotiation. It's a waste of time, I think.
Okay, thank you. Now I think that I give floor to the panelists to respond first, and then we can move on. Mr. Kotani, I think that
Yes, thank you very much. Two questions. One is how Japan's East China Sea policy should be. I personally agree that the Japanese policy toward Senkaku should be more, stronger. But at the same time, I think we have missed several opportunities. The important thing is, we should not give any impression that Japan is overreacting to the Chinese provocation. So, for example, in August 2012, the Chinese activists landed on the Senkaku Islands, and we arrested on land. Perhaps that was a missed opportunity. We should have kept our policemen there to deal with a further landing. And also, the Chinese warships passed through the contiguous zone this June, and I think we also missed the opportunity that we should have kept our self-defense forces in the contiguous zones after Chinese warships passed through the contiguous zone. So we should avoid the overreaction, but at the same time, I think we should not miss certain opportunities to establish our, to demonstrate our administration of the Senkaku Islands. And about the Japanese economic engagement in the ASEAN, although this is not my specialty, but I understand, first of all, Japanese business is now taking the so-called China Plus One formula. So although we are continuing our investment in China, but we are actually reducing our foreign direct investment in China. But instead, we are allocating our assets into the other regional countries, particularly the ASEAN countries. So that is one thing. And also, perhaps Japan and China may be competing over the economic influence in ASEAN, but perhaps Japan is trying to provide more high standard economic assistance to ASEAN countries. The AIIB and the ADB competition is one example. Japan didn't join the AIIB because of the concern about the quality of their projects. But instead, we are now enhancing the ADB so that we can continue to provide high standard assistance for the ASEAN countries. But our competition may not be necessarily exclusive. For example, there's already a cooperation between ADB and the AIIB. So our competition may become more cooperative and a complementary relationship. And last word about the Professor Scott's comments about the middle powers. I don't think Japan regards itself as a middle power. Our previous government perhaps tried to regard Japan as a middle power, but the current government rejected this idea. And we don't use the term great power, but we use the term tier one nation. So perhaps Japan doesn't belong to the middle power in Asia. Thanks.
One question, which is there some thinking within the Delhi policy circle with if it can be repeated in the Indian Ocean region? When you talk to in India, the same question, the answers would be different when the answer is by Ministry of Defense, Indian Navy, and Ministry of External Affairs. So the Ministry of Defense still looks at its priority and its threats coming from land-based. Indian Navy wants to do more in the maritime domain, both in the Indian Ocean region and in the South China Sea, and the Ministry of External Affairs in somewhere in between. But there is, and the Indian Navy seriously thinks that it is a bigger power in the Indian Ocean region, and that it has that environment in control for the next at least 5 to 10 years. But there is also this thought process that we need to start doing more and secure that advantage that we have in the Indian Ocean region. There is a greater sense within the strategic community to change India, to kind of enhance India's capabilities in the Indian Ocean region, but it's not reflected in the Ministry of Defense at all. They don't look at anything in the South China Sea as any of India's business, or in something that could directly threaten India's interest, or as a threat at all. China is a competition in the Indian Ocean region, not a threat. But when China collaborates with Pakistan in the Indian Ocean region, it automatically becomes a threat. So there has been some consideration to renew India's maritime outlook and break free from traditional thinking, but that change is going to be first reflected in the Indian Ocean region and then later in the South China Sea. So it's going to be a while before we see some more active participation from India in the Indian Ocean region. The other thing that India has to consider is the repercussions of a stepped-up collaboration in the South China Sea on its northern borders. I mean, it's surrounded by China and Pakistan, who call each other their best friends, two countries India's gone to war with. So have we really reached the favorable environment where we can secure our borders from the north and step up our collaborations in South China Sea when China is so sensitive about? So I don't think so. That is a major constraint for the Ministry of External Affairs, and the Ministry of Defense definitely thinks that without having a favorable environment within our northern border, which is actually where our imminent threats come from, it's wise for us to kind of fight a battle that we can't sustain.
Thank you for the questions. First, Mr. Yamagami, you're right. You're absolutely right that there are various types of leadership. And in fact, the example you mentioned is actually what Indonesia did when it was still the acknowledged leader of ASEAN throughout the 1980s and 1990s. I think the previous session also mentioned how, Indonesia's leading role in this constructive role in ASEAN. It actually initiated 4 informal workshops to reduce tensions and building confidence between claimants. So that's exactly what Indonesia did to a very successful degree back then in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, I think the problem is not that we are lacking of ideas of how to be a leader. I mean, ideas are there. I mean, we in the foreign policy communities, scholars in Indonesia have presented and given ideas and suggestions on, what Indonesia should do in South China Sea. The problem is that, there is no intention to actually be a leader at this point. It is not in the interest of the current government to actually raise its role in ASEAN at the moment because, as I said, the focus is elsewhere. What the government cares about at the moment is domestic development, building infrastructure, the economy, increasing investment. That's where the focus is at now, not about ASEAN, unfortunately, again. Second question from Professor O'Neill about the internal dynamics debates in Indonesia. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right also about the differences of statements from the foreign ministry and the military. Just to name a few, is just back in 2014, there were at least two very strong statements coming from within the military. One, the most significant was this article written by the then Commander-in-Chief Muldoko in the Wall Street Journal about Indonesia and South China Sea, how it is a claimant state and so on and so forth, which was then rebutted by or clarified by the foreign ministry. So the foreign ministry in 2014 was very busy making clarifications by statements from the military. And in 2015, it was even more interesting when President Joko Widodo traveled to Tokyo and made a statement about how Indonesia rejects the 9-dash line, which only in a mere few days clarified by himself. So if the foreign ministry has to clarify the military, the president has to clarify himself what he said about the South China Sea. So this explains, this gives you a picture about there are different tones of what Indonesia should and should not do in the South China Sea, and it's very obvious the differences between the foreign ministry and the military. So that's why earlier this year, I think the president got tired about this, these debates and different dynamics within the government and how clarifications has to be made repeatedly. That's why earlier this year, mid this year, after the various Natuna incidents, he actually instructed the then coordinating minister for political security and legal affairs, Luhut Panjaitan, to be sort of like the focal point to formulate all policies with regards to the South China Sea. Now, the foreign ministry would still be the spokesperson, the institution that will convey all sorts of policies related to South China Sea and all sorts of policies related to foreign policy. But the president decided that the coordinating minister for political security and legal should be the institution that should gather all kinds of inputs from all institutions within the government, and anything that any institutions within the government say should be in line with whatever is formulated by this coordinating ministry. So we haven't really seen any significant changes, although there has been, reduced statements coming from the military. But I suppose this is one way to tackle all these different opinions from within the government itself. Last question, Mr. Pitlow, about 2012 and then Kunming. Simple answer is different foreign ministers, different presidents. Yudhoyono is definitely different from Joko Widodo, and Martin Natalegawa is definitely different from Retno Marsudi. As I said earlier in my presentation, the current foreign minister, Retno, she is very much always looking for directions from the president. While on the other hand, I think Martin had more freedom to make initiatives back then in 2012, and he was a man full of initiatives. He always had ideas, and that's why he was commended for many of his efforts back in 2012. I guess now it's a totally different personalities and different types of government, and I guess that's a simple answer I can give you.
I had 3 questions put to me. I'll take them in the order they were asked. From Yamagami-san about whether Australia faces a Munich moment in the South China Sea. I think there has been a problem, a disconnect between elite concern and popular opinion. And the South China Sea is a long way. It's difficult to convince the Australian public that there is a direct national interest, although I believe there clearly is. So I think that's where the where the rub really lies is in removing that barrier between the public debate and the elite concern, which already has, I think, found considerable expression about the potential threat of power projection from China's militarized facilities in the South China Sea in future, which may potentially bring direct implications for Australia's own defence for the first time. That's an unknown commodity in dealing with China, not just in the South China Sea, but of course China is pushing ever forward in terms of its operational patrols into the Eastern Indian Ocean, which have come very close in some cases to Australian territories there. But I think, and to connect that to defence procurement, I mean, yes, it was unfortunate from Japan's perspective that the submarine decision ended up the way that it did, but the upshot is still a commitment to build 12 submarines. That commitment really only makes sense in the context of concern about a future hedge against China's strategic ambitions. So in that sense, I think there's no diminution on the Australian side. But I think it's really the fact that the South China Sea has played this role catalytic, as I said, in energising a broader debate about China in Australia. And I think in that, it's not simply the South China Sea that features, but it's also an important debate about the economic proximity that we choose to have, the commercial decisions that we choose and choose not to have, and the role about Chinese influence. And I think that may actually be the more important concern in the interim, but they are connected. On the second question that was put to me about national interest and whether Australia would be, I'm paraphrasing here, but in a passive sense, waiting for the US and China and being solely dependent on them. I didn't mean to imply that there was any sole dependence there. I think Australia does have a clear and independently articulated national interest, and if it didn't, then it shouldn't be involved. But Australia on its own cannot really count in a power sense. From that point of view, the alliance will always be a key consideration in the South China Sea. But I think it's more subtle than that. We're not just talking about balance of power, we're also talking about a balance of resolve and psychology here. And Australia's ability to demonstrate its options in concert with other countries like-minded that have an interest in maritime security and preservation of the order, India, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, others in our Southeast Asian region. I think that's also, those are options that Australia has and should be exercising diplomatically, not simply in a military sense. And the five-power defence arrangement is a unique mechanism that Australia has. United States is not part of that, and that links us directly to the security of two South China Sea facing Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia and Singapore. Thirdly, Izawa-san, you asked about concern about the US-Australia alliance relationship, and specifically in relation to the cost sharing about the US marine presence in the Northern Territory. Japan, of course, has a long-standing tradition of providing generous host nation support, but has not itself been immune to problems in cost sharing in marine presence in Okinawa with Henoko and other issues. Those have also been very hard-fought back-and-forth negotiations. I think this is one of those hard-fought back-and-forth negotiations. But I had a conversation recently in which I heard an interesting perspective from the US side, that this was a deployment that was also partly political in character. It was announced as the sort of formative military side of the US rebalance when President Obama came to Canberra, so it has a particular symbolic importance. That may have created some problems in terms of the presence being political first before it was actually the military rationale was worked out, and that probably does require a bit of fine-tuning and adjustment and hard bargaining, frankly, between the two allies. But I think what trumps that ultimately, I shouldn't use Trump as a verb in current circumstances, it does get to a symbolic question about how the alliance is functioning. And if I'm right that in the South China Sea questions are beginning to be asked about Australia's reliability, then for the money that we're talking about, $20 or $30 million, I agree. I think a political decision should be taken. It should have been taken already. I thought that Vice President Biden's visit was actually going to have the sign-off on that. It didn't happen, and I hope it does happen soon, because I think there is an issue about potential complacency within the alliance. And I say that guardedly. The military integration is extremely deep, and in the Middle East, we have a very clear example of that. But we're in a different paradigm now, and where questions of coalition support in the Middle East and expeditionary support to Afghanistan is not going to be the name of the game in the Australian-US alliance. It's going to be much more about the near region and in a much sort of higher strategic stakes kind of way. And although the Marines are not strategically important in that balance, symbolically I think it's a question that needs to be answered.
Any other question? So please.
This will be quick. I'm John Gould, I'm from Defence, Track 2, so not representing my organisation today. I just want to ask you, or anybody else who might know the answer, Australia doesn't have a national policy for FONOPS. America does, National Security Presidential Direction. It's funded, directed whole of national organisations. It goes everywhere in the world and expends capital to push back on targeted nations who are perceived to be applying excessive controls against air and maritime access. It predates the South China Sea dynamic at the moment. So if you're in the US, you've actually got a national imperative, a policy, it's funded, it's directed, and it's not about the South China Sea per se. In Australia, we don't have a policy on FONOPS. I don't think, and my question is, have we ever gone anywhere in the world, deliberate with military force or anything else, to achieve an UNCLOS protest effect? Somebody may know, I've never seen it. We are now being asked to do that uniquely in the South China Sea, where we don't have a national policy on this. We do military activities and operations and goodwill activities in the world where we need to do those things. At some point in time, a gateway moment, I'm sure, will trigger this potential overlap between a US NSPD FONOP idea and Australia's capacity to demonstrate, apart from with political discourse, but with action, the fact that we don't recognise a 12 nautical mile effect attributing to those created spaces. So my question is, has anybody seen Australia acting in a deliberate way to protest any other nation's excessive application of sovereign interpretation in a similar way that we're now assuming that we may choose to do in South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you. My quick question to Kotanishan and Dr. Muhibat. Any internal discussion within Japan or Indonesia to follow Philippines' practice in bringing maritime issues in East China Sea and South China Sea to arbitration? Thank you.
Perhaps I invite the panelists to respond.
I'll have a go. I'm aware that there are serving or recently retired Navy in the audience who probably know the answer on what Australia has done better than I will. But let me answer it this way. I think Australia's position is not identical to the United States. And in some cases, I think Australia has even been on the receiving end of US demonstrations, as has Japan in the past. So there is that awkward element to it, and I think that's partly why having freedom of navigation front and centre of the South China Sea approach puts Australia in an awkward spot, and I would like to see that change, because it's an unfortunate byproduct of having that, I think, so centrally. But of course, Australia does, it's an island nation, it's sometimes forgot, but we do depend on that for our trade, and into the bargain have exactly the same issues about access, both in an economic sense and a military sense. And as I made clear in the presentation, historically Australia's key interest has been, for obvious geographical reasons, access through the archipelago to our north. And there we have had, at least diplomatically, negotiations. Whether protests were part of that, I don't know. Whether operational demonstrations were part of that, I don't know. What you usually hear from Navy colleagues is that the Australia's preference is for low-key, business as usual, out of the public limelight. So if it has happened and we haven't heard about it, that's probably not a coincidence. I think the point is not to raise the political temperature by having attendant publicity. And the US was in the same position until 2015. The Freedom of Navigation program was a relatively unknown part of the DoD, which functioned well in its limited aims without attracting that sort of political temperature. But because the strategic situation has also escalated, I think that's inevitably that there's a feedback in there, and the way that the follow-ups were sometimes conducted with the full glare of media speculation about when or where they were going to be held was obviously unhelpful, and I think against from the US preference from a military side about how they should have been ideally conducted. So that's my attempt to answer your question.
So, Mr. Potani?
Okay, briefly on the FONAP, as far as I know, the US is the only country that has the freedom of navigation operation. The FONAP is actually part of the Freedom of Navigation program, which is a joint program between State Department and Pentagon, and which consists of diplomatic efforts and also operational assertions. And the Maritime Self-Defense Force officers told me that the Maritime Self-Defense Force actually has a similar operation to exercise the navigational rights under international law in the high seas, but we don't have a US version of FONAP. So that is why we are discussing whether we should join the US FONAP or not, because we don't have such a concept. And about the legal measures, there's some discussion inside our ruling party, LDP, whether Japan should initiate a legal case, arbitration over the joint development of gas fields along the median line in the East China Sea. Japan and China agreed on the joint development in 2008, but China has been rejecting to make it a binding treaty and exercising the unilateral developments. So we are discussing whether the legal measures can change the Chinese behavior. But otherwise, I don't think we have discussing any legal measures.
Okay, following the Philippines practice, no, we're not a claimant state, so we don't have a case to bring to court. Fishing, that's a different issue. For fishing, for us, IUU fishing and illegal fishings that occurred and on all the cases occur within our own territorial waters. So we have our own national law to resolve that. We don't need to go into any international court to do that. And yeah, so that's basically the thinking of the current government, that everything that falls within Indonesian territory, that it should be resolved by national law. And to talk about the Greater South China Sea, I mean, of course, there are these ideas because Indonesia applauds the Philippines of what it has achieved with that. And we, in Indonesia's statement, although it's for me, it's a kind of lousy statement, only 2 paragraphs of absolutely nothing. But basically it says about how Indonesia respects international law and how the international community should, abide to UNCLOS. And that's the general tone of how Indonesia responds to the tribunal ruling, that we applaud the Philippines, and then we respect international law, but absolutely no idea whatsoever to follow that path.
So I see no more questions. That's right. Before adjourning the session, I would like to again thank our panelists for their contributions, and thank the delegates for their active, very active participation. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.